This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
I'm Michael Riedel.
There's a wonderful concert version of GYPSY right now at City Center with Patti LuPone, and it's directed by one of our all-time favorite guests, Arthur Laurents.
We did an interview with Arthur Laurents a few years ago, and he talks a lot about making the original production of GYPSY and his great friendship with Julie Stein, who wrote the score. So we want to show you some excerpts of that interview that we did with Arthur Laurents, I think 4 or 5 years ago now.
7. Tonight's guest wrote my all-time favorite musical, GYPSY, and a number of other wonderful musicals, plays, and movies.
In addition to GYPSY, Arthur Laurents wrote West Side Story, Time of the Cuckoo, and Home of the Brave. He directed La Cage aux Folles on Broadway, and he wrote the screenplay to The Way We Were. He's a terrific guest and a wonderful talker. He also has written his autobiography, Original Story by Arthur Laurents, that has just been published in paperback by Applause Books, and we are delighted to have him tonight on Theater Talk.
I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome. All right, Arthur. This is a very candid, chatty, gossipy, ferocious, and I think very moving memoir as well. Let's start at the very beginning. The Brooklyn boy who wants to be a writer. What was it in your family, in your home life, that propelled you to decide, I want to write to make money? I want to write to be...
I don't have a clue.
Not at all?
No. The only thing I can remember is I wrote a short story, and it was all in dialogue when I was 10 or so. So I suppose that said I should be a playwright. At least I thought it did.
But in the book, though, you talk about the importance of, and no one thinks about this now, of course, radio. You listen to radio plays, and you, in some ways, learned how to write by listening to the radio. Did you not?
No. I learned how to write by writing. I don't think you can learn, really, by going to school. I gave a seminar in musical theater at NYU. George Wolfe was one of my students. And maybe he learned something. But I think he was talented before that. I think the only way you learn is by doing, or by reading, or by going and seeing. And when I was a kid, near where I grew up in Brooklyn, they had a stock company. So, you know, my memory goes back to the Passion Play, I suppose, but I mean, you know, thousands of years. And then when I was a kid, I was taken to, my father was a lawyer, and his office was near Times Square, and his secretary took me to the theater. And then when they thought I was old enough, my parents, I think I was 12, I went alone, which the audience gossiped about. I could hear them. What's he doing here? Why is that child at this play?
Were you going to adult plays that were not necessarily
plays
for
they
children?
thought were adult, and I thought were terrible.
Like
I mean, I knew Grand
Rain.
Hotel was kitsch when I went. However old I was, they didn't.
But you absorbed it all.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that you say about writing your book, which I found absolutely fascinating, was you analyzed movies and you picked the plot twists in them and numbered them. And then what would you do after you'd numbered them?
Well, that was necessity. I began writing for radio and was successful enough that I was asked to write a lot of these half-hour dramatic shows, and it was hard to think up an original plot. So I took the plots of successful movies, figured out they had this incident and that, and I lettered them, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. And I thought, okay, for this show I will use B, J, and Z.
Right.
And
Just
then,
randomly?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then twist them. No matter what they were, I twisted them. And it was great fun.
But you do say in the book that writing for radio taught you another important thing, which was concision, which seems to me to be a great skill to have when you write the book to a musical.
It taught me two things. One was economy, because it's the only medium where there is time. You can take as much time as you want in films, as they call them, movies I call them, or the theater. But television and radio, it has to be, you have, 26 minutes out of a half hour. The other thing I learned, there was an editor, script editor for one of these radio shows, and he called me into his office one day, and he said to me, "You have talent," which I wanted to cry. He was the first person who said that. And he said, "However, you're too facile. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you make transitions through words, and they should be through emotions. And to this day, that's the most important piece of advice somebody gave me. And if you go to movies or to theater, you will hear the transitions done verbally,
so
not
often,
emotionally.
and it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
You write a great deal about your Hollywood years. In the putting together of movies, it was so harrowing. That's amazing you stuck with it. The things that you had to get through to get your stuff on the screen, even in an approximation of what you intended.
Well, I did The Way We Were.
Well, yeah, way later.
And that was not a pleasant experience.
Why? What was the problem on that? You go into it in detail in the book, but give us the snapshot version that made it so miserable for you.
Sidney Pollack. Sidney Pollack doesn't understand love. And this was a love story. And it's really that simple. There was an exchange in the picture between Streisand and Redford when she said, I wish we loved each other. And he said, the trouble is we do. Sidney Pollack said, that doesn't make sense. The defense rests.
But didn't they also make you soften the politics? I mean, that was to me the way that you were all of a sudden what was going on.
I was the only person connected with it who knew anything about the witch hunt, so of course they didn't listen to me.
And the movie was about the witch.
Yeah, right.
How could this be?
Well, they cut the climactic scene in the picture, and I've taken the rap for it since. In the picture, Streisand was a communist. She marries Redford, who was Redford.
But with your talent. A beautiful man with incredible writing talent.
Susan, you don't think I'm beautiful?
I do think you're beautiful, but not in that conventional way.
You had to fight you for that role.
I don't have the hair or the teeth.
They really wanted you.
Yeah. Anyway, he comes back from the studio. It's interesting. The scene begins, what you see on the screen, she says something about willy-nilly circumstances force you to do what you make a decision. The marriage had been on the rocks, or headed for the rocks. And then there's a jump, and she says, well, if we get a divorce, there are no problems. Well, what was left out was, he said, he comes home from the studio, and he said, the studio wants to fire me because my wife is a subversive. And so unless you inform, they will fire me. So she says, well, willy-nilly circumstances force you to make a decision. If we get a divorce, there's no problem.
So who forced that to be taken out?
And why would they take that out? Were they afraid of the politics of the time, or did they just not care?
It didn't make Redford look too well.
Oh, and that's right, and that was Redford's call.
I don't know whether it was Redford's call, but I just know it did not make his character. You know, they labored then, and they still labor, that if someone like Robert Redford, who was once a very good actor, plays a hero, he has to be heroic.
Right.
Why?
Can't have any flaws.
Why can't he be human?
So better the end of the movie make no sense than have Redford look
Be a
bad.
human being.
Right.
Yes. Well, there you
Well,
go.
the heartbreaking thing was that nobody noticed.
I noticed.
Well, you're smart.
You got away with
You
it.
suddenly went, huh?
Yeah, right.
The witch hunts, the blacklisting, important key part of your life, an important part of the book. When did you first become active politically in the Communist Party and in left-wing causes?
I was never in the Communist Party.
You were never a communist?
No. I first became active, I think, when I was, let's see, 14 or 15. You know what, your parents have friends that you call aunt and uncle and they're not? Well, mine did, and it was a cousin, Marion her name was. She was fierce and she was a rebel and I adored her. And first she dragged me to the Christian Science church. And we sat, and I remember there was a woman in a wheelchair on the platform and she never got up. So we thought, well, Christian Science
So much
doesn't
for
work.
that, right?
So the next thing she went to was the Communist Party. And they said, get the kid out of here. But she indoctrinated me, as it were, and I saved tinfoil for loyalist Spain, and that was the beginning. But also on a deeper level, my father was one of the most humanitarian people I've ever known, and he was very liberal and always on that side, and that's how I was brought up. And, you know, I was brought up in the Depression, and people, the only people who were really doing anything were the communists or the socialists. And it was, nobody said subversive. This was quite popular, in fact. I'm a very passionate person, and what I care about, and what I don't, watch out. That's what it comes down to.
So did love inspire your greatest works for the musical theater in the way it inspired your tenure in Hollywood?
No.
No.
There's such a thing as wanting to, you want to create something that transcends you, that is beyond you. And you inform it if you don't pay too much attention to yourself. Who and what you are will inform the work. You don't have to push at it. And if you're any good, you will get involved in the characters. I think it's all character. When they asked me to do Gypsy, I didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I didn't care about the striptease queen of America. So one of the producers said, well, think about it, you'll come up with something. And finally, through a whole thing which I tell about in the book, I decided the mother, which was a fortunate decision.
I mean, what's more universal than that mother?
But where did you stumble on the mother, that character? Reading the books, talking to Gypsy Rose Lee?
Gypsy Rose Lee was allergic to the truth. Yeah. She, I tried to find out things from her. She was funny, she was charming, and she was evasive. You just couldn't get anything out of her. I mean, I asked her where she got her name. She said, oh, darling, I've given so many versions. Make up your own, it'll be better. Then she said to me that the leading man in the musical, Herbie, the agent,
right.
She said, oh, I wish I'd thought of Herbie for my autobiography.
Yes,
she was dead serious.
Right. Well, but there were many Herbies in her autobiography. Even the mother had many, many men. Yeah. but she sort of, but that's sort of a universal archetype. That mother, that showbiz killer.
Yes, but you know, it's funny. In any production of it I've been connected with, sooner or later, the mother of one of the kids comes up to me and says, Mr. Laurents, why don't you write my story?
Hello? There it is.
You know, what do you say? I said, well, maybe I will.
Maybe I will.
They don't connect.
They don't get it.
A very, very good friend of mine, as a matter of fact, Judy Prince's mother, said to me, well, if it weren't for that mother, those girls would have never have gotten out of Seattle.
Well, there you go.
She had a point.
It's true.
It's true.
There'd be no show business if it weren't for that mother.
Yeah.
Yep.
The many figures who cross these pages in your book, Jerome Robbins, whose talent I think you admired greatly, but whom you came to dislike intensely, although you seem to have had no real personal feelings for him at all by the time he died. You even say in the book when you heard that he died, you thought, in the death of a great director, choreographer, not a friend, not a human being to me.
Right. Well, because he wasn't a human being.
Really?
I didn't think so. He was, you know, when I first met him, he was giggly. He was fun. He liked playing really rather childish games. I mean, not, you know, well, yeah, practically treasure hunts, that kind of thing.
And at what point did you meet him?
I met him in the 40s. I was in the Army and he was in the ballet, and I met him just before he became Jerome Robbins. Fancy Free hadn't been done. And it was my introduction to the ballet, and I met him and Nora Kay, and we went drinking together, and then all that, and then he became famous, and then later he asked me to write West Side. And we went through that experience.
Well, when did the change happen? I mean, what happened to the giggly, fun guy?
Opening night of Fancy Free, I wasn't there, but Nora Kay told me. She had a party for him, and he hid under the bed. Success was something he couldn't take. I've heard that, And it's been hard for me to understand, but apparently. And then he became suspicious. You only wanted him because he was this big hotshot success.
And didn't he begin to surround himself, though, by acolytes as he got more and more famous? Sycophants, really?
Yes, he did, but I will say this much in his behalf. The acolytes are waiting in the wings for anybody who has any kind of success. They're just waiting to become parasites to the prince. And he was foolish enough to surround himself with them. I mean, I think people who tell you you're marvelous are very destructive.
So Jerome Robbins becomes famous and suspicious, yet you're still friendly with him. He still respects your talent. The break comes, though, when he informs and names. For you, it's unforgivable. It's Judas. He becomes Judas. He betrays his friends. Why did he do it?
Same reason Kazan did it. They wanted to work in movies.
Pure opportunism?
Absolutely. There is no other reason. It's absolute bilge about saving America from communism.
You don't believe what their justification that, Stalinism was what communism had become. Stalinism was a force of evil. It was a threat to American democracy, and therefore we did it to protect the values of democracy.
Oh, I believe that, but that has nothing to do with those people running around Hollywood and Broadway. I mean, I knew them. I mean, well, again, practical. Tell me one movie that anybody made that had communist propaganda. You know the one that was quoted by Ginger Rogers' mother? Share and share alike. Communist propaganda, she said.
Robbins came to you and told you he had named names. You had a meeting with him.
Yes.
And he cried.
And he cried, and frankly, I fell for it. We had been very good friends, and I did say to him, he said, I don't know, I guess it won't be for years till I find out whether I did the right thing. And I said, no, I can tell you right now, you were a shit. But he cried. And I'd known him, through formative years for both of us. And despite your portrait of me as some kind of armadillo or crocodile, I'm not that tough. And I was really touched and thought, well, he's a friend. You've got to stand by a friend. Then, you see, he screwed me. That's when I thought, as I say in the book, you're not evil because you inform. You inform because you're evil. And he was evil.
And how did he screw you?
Well, when West Side Story opened in Washington, it was this enormous success which none of us expected. And the first thing that happened was Steve Sondheim wasn't mentioned in the reviews because he was nobody.
Right.
And Lenny Bernstein, and he had the credit for the lyrics. And Lenny incredibly went to him and said, I'll take my name off. It's more important for you than for me. Which Steve came to me and said, should I let him do it? I think it's because he didn't like some of the lyrics and he didn't want the blame. But anyway, I thought Lenny was just, and they had only met on the show.
Right.
Really? Yeah.
So then we were given the keys to the city, Washington, not Steve, Jerry and Lenny and I. And the credits had conceived by Jerome Robbins, which I had agreed to because I thought, well, it means based on Romeo and Juliet.
Although you'd all been working on the idea for years together, right?
Well, actually, he brought it up once. I thought it was Xavier's Irish Rose to Music because he wanted Jews and Catholics, and we dropped it and came back to it 5 or 6 years later, and then it was Rush. But anyway, the idea for using gangs and juvenile delinquents was mine. So we get the keys to the city, and the guy, or whoever it was on the TV show, says, this is in recognition of what you have done for juvenile delinquency. That was your concept, wasn't it, Mr. Robbins? And Jerry said, yes. Well, you don't get on television and say you're a liar. Lenny and I looked at each other. And then afterwards, I went to him and I said, Lenny did this for Steve, and since they obviously think conception means this, I think you should remove your name. And he said, let me think about it. And he came back the next day and he said, you're right, but it's too important.
And that's where this is where you thought this man is an opportunist.
Absolutely. Because I think people are the most important thing in the world. And that you register that in two ways, with friends and people you love. And he wasn't a friend, and I no longer loved him. That was that.
Yet, you went back to work for him again with GYPSY. Why?
Because I thought then and still think he was certainly the best choreographer that has ever done Broadway. And he staged brilliantly. He couldn't direct actors. That was the shortcoming in him as a man. And I think part of his bad behavior was that he wasn't articulate. And he'd get so frustrated in not being able to explain what he wanted that he would say terrible things. But actually we got along better on GYPSY because it was totally professional. I think that's one thing that people should be able to do, is put all that outside the theater, outside the stage door.
Well, like Mostel went back to work with him on Fiddler.
Yes, and that was interesting because on Fiddler, and they said to him, because Zero had been blacklisted, and he knew Jerry informed. And he said, well, I don't have to have lunch with them. And that was quoted to me, and I thought that was something. And then a friend said to me, well, that's a cop-out. Well, you may shrug at that, but it's something that gave me a lot to think about. Because when you work with somebody like that, you're validating them. And that came to haunt me, and that ended up my writing a play called Jolson Sings Again, because of that, where you're not so pristine.
Was it opportunism on your part to go back to work with Jerry Robbins for GYPSY, knowing that he was the great director and he could probably turn out a hit for you?
No. First of all, believe it or not, I've only thought about hits once, which resulted in the biggest flop of my career.
Nick and Nora, that would be?
Nick and Nora. I went back to work with him because he was good, and I had this idea of Rose. And when I get excited about something, then I hang on, and you know, I wanted to do it. And but I never thought. You may think because Ethel Merman was in it was going to be a success. Her last show had been a flop, and the advance for that show, if you care about such unartistic things, was $300,000 for GYPSY. And David Merrick said to me in Philadelphia, if we don't get good reviews, we close in 3 weeks. You know.
Was David Merrick an evil man?
I love him.
You did?
I thought he was. No, he wasn't. He was a mischievous man. He was a wicked man. He wasn't evil. But that, I mean, he had a cockamamie theory that if he kept all the creative people at each other's throats, the show would come out better.
And then, is that what you did on GYPSY? Did he try to pit you against?
Oh, try. He may think to me, Jerry Robbins is ruining your work, just absolutely destroying it. You know, he did things like that.
Your reputation in the theater world is very interesting. I mean, you are supposedly the mean, the nasty, the sharp-tongued Arthur Laurents. You'll take someone's head off if you disagree with them. Some people are afraid of you. Is this true, or do you find that you're just candid and people sometimes can't take the truth?
Well, of course I don't think it's true. I think you're being accurate in what they say. I know it. I think they say it less, possibly because I'm around less. But I think they've also gotten used to it. See, I have a philosophy that is different from most people in the theater. I think if somebody asks you what you think, not opening night, but I mean early on, if you're a friend, you help. You don't have to be right. You say, this is my opinion. Well, most people don't. And I think they're terrible friends because and I also think a little of Schadenfreude is involved there. Because I really think this may be where the reputation comes from, that I think secretly a lot of them think, let them fail. I don't.